in the Santo Tomas camp, I was interned at the age of 11, and when we were freed, I was 14. So I like to think I have a pretty good recollection of most of the events that occurred during that period.
Tell me, why were you born in the Philippines? Tell me about your family.
It's sort of a complicated story. My father's parents, my grandparents, were escaping from Russia, pogroms in Russia. In 1901, they, for some reason, which I don't understand, they went east across Russia to Siberia, Vladivostok, took a ship to the U.S., and my father was born during that trip. The ship was in Nagasaki, Japan at the time. And in addition to being pregnant with my father, my mother had 6 other kids with her at the time, and her husband. They ended up in Portland, Oregon. He grew up there, and then he moved to Israel. Palestine, not Israel at the time. And then he fought with the British Army in World War I. He was in on the capture of Jerusalem from the Turks and all that. Anyway, he and later there were 9 siblings altogether. Most of them came back to Portland, Oregon. And in the 20s, he joined the U.S. Army and was sent to Manila in 1928. And then, now here comes my mother's part of it. She was born in Poland, and she wanted to leave, and she had to falsify her age in order to be allowed to travel alone. She was, 18, I think. She said she was 20. And she traveled to live with an aunt in Shanghai. And the aunt tried to get her to marry a Chinese doctor, and my mother didn't seem to like the idea. She hopped on a ship, went to Manila. She was thinking of going to an uncle in New York. But in Manila, of course, she met my father at the lone synagogue there. And they got married, and my father got out of the army there. They liked it. And the Depression was on here. They settled there. He went to work, eventually started his own business, office equipment business. So we were living in Manila when the war began, and of course were interned in January of 1942.
So tell me, when you say you were interned, of course, at that point, so your family was there, you were in Manila. Did you have any premonition that World War II was actually going to come to the Philippines? I mean, where were you when you found out there might be an issue of being interned?
Well, I was just before the war. I had my birthday in December of 41, so I was just before the war. I was 10, and I got these rustlings from listening to adults talking about, well, it looks bad, looks like war will come. I myself, probably as a kid, didn't think that much about it, and as far as I know, the adults were somewhat concerned about it. And nonetheless, it was December 8th in Manila. I'm a radio fan. I don't even watch much TV. I always listen to the radio. I got up to get ready to go to school. It was Monday morning in Manila. I turned on the radio first thing, and I hear about the Pearl Harbor attack. And my father was in the bathroom shaving. My mother was getting dressed. My mother worked with my father at their office equipment business. I went in and said, the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. And my father says, you're crazy. he didn't believe it. So I said, listen to this. So they go out and listen. I'll never forget that scene. Anyway, they took me to school and went to work, and that was the last day that I went to school. But I got off the subject. You asked. I personally hadn't really thought that much about war coming, but I'm pretty sure the adults were aware something was going to happen.
So were there, talk to me about, so your parents were active in the Jewish community in Manila. How big was the community that you knew of, and how big was the synagogue, and where did people come from?
I believe the Jewish community in Manila was probably somewhere around a couple of hundred people, and I'm just estimating. My parents would have been able to give you a better figure, but we, of course, used to go to the synagogue regularly and mingled there. My mother had made the curtain for the ark and all that sort of thing. There was one synagogue in Manila, not too far from where we lived, and I probably tried to avoid mingling with the adults and more or less kept together with the younger kids. So I never really heard too much about what might have been happening in Europe, or whether they even knew much about the beginnings of the Holocaust or things like that. That was not really part of my consciousness. As far as the Japanese community is concerned, I don't recall any contacts with Japanese or anything like that, businesses. My father never mentioned anything about it. Most of the Japanese that I knew about probably were gardeners and things like that, but I don't there's mainly a Chinese business presence in the Philippines, which is quite large, at that time, rather than Japanese.
Did you know about any people that had come possibly from China to the Philippines because the Japanese had given them problems in China?
There were several members of the Jewish community who had come to Manila from China, mainly, as I recall, Shanghai. And there was one family in particular we became quite close with. There were, I think 3 brothers and the mother. The brothers weren't married at that time, and the mother. And we got quite close with them. In fact, when the war began, as the Japanese entered the city, Americans were advised to move to more secure areas. We lived somewhat at that time on the outskirts, farther out of Manila. We moved in with this family who had come from Germany and then China. And we were living with them when the Japanese rounded up the Americans. Now, this family, at that time, the 2 of the sons were gone, a mother and son. They were not interned. They were apparently not enemy aliens. They were German. They were not interned. They were outside. But we were interned, taken from their place. We were living with them. It was in closer to center of town and was thought to be somewhat safer. By the way, the story comes to mind about the son. When the Japanese were destroying Manila, when the Americans were returning to free Manila, the mother was killed, bayoneted by the Japanese. The son also, he was left for dead, but he happened to survive, in very bad condition, and he asked someone, tell Meadows in the camp in Santo Tomas, tell Meadows that Joe Rector is out here, needs help. My father went out and got him into the camp hospital and saved his life. But and those were our closest friends. They had come from Europe and then China, as you asked about.
So the question now becomes, so there were Germans that had come that might have been Germans that were Jewish?
Yes.
And then there were Germans that were Germans. Do you think that there were Germans that were pro-Nazi, and that's why the Japanese didn't intern them?
Well, I'm sure there were pro-Nazi Germans, but I think Germans in general were not interned. The strange thing is that non-enemy alien Jews were not really bothered by the Japanese, unlike the situation in Europe under Germany and to some extent Italy. The Japanese did not seem to have any particular animus against Jews. In fact, now this is, some would be a bit skeptical of this, but my parents persuaded the camp Japanese commandant when I turned 13 in December 1943. Somehow they got him to let me go out to be bar mitzvahed at the synagogue. And the Japanese would only let either my mother or father. I guess they didn't want the whole family out. So my father went with me. We wore our red armbands. We had a one-day pass. We went out and went to the synagogue, and I went through my bar mitzvah ceremony, and we returned. And of course, my mother wasn't able to be there. But that's an example of what I say, that the Japanese didn't seem to care if you were Jewish or not.
So who was an enemy alien? An enemy alien was...
Well, that would be the U.S., Britain, France. Yeah, the Allies. Yeah,
so say
right.
In that sense, who was an enemy alien? The enemy alien was, okay.
An enemy alien was a citizen of countries at war with Japan. Exactly. Neutrals were out, Swiss, and so on. And that's why there were a number of Jews outside who were not enemy aliens and were able to, in my case, attend the bar mitzvah and have a minyan and enough people for that.
So let's say, tell me first how you got to the camp, and then how you were taken from this family, and then we'll talk about maybe how you prepared and had any kind of a religious life at the camp. So let's talk about, so you were 11 and you're living with a German family. So you pick up from the time of the German family when your family was actually rounded up. Tell me about that.
Actually, first, my father, we were told, the announcement was, as everyone would tell you, that just take enough things for 3 days. And my father took enough things for 3 days, food and clothing. And he was interned. He went to this roundup point. He was interned. My mother and I used to go visit him every day and take food in. You could send in food through the package line, I think it was called. And then 3 weeks later, we were interned. We had to go in ourselves, so we packed our stuff. 3 days, obviously, was out of the question. I mean, we knew it was becoming permanent, so we moved in. He was interned. My father was interned on January 4th, and I think that was the first day in Santo Tomas. And then we were interned January 25th. We entered the camp January 25th. And we were assigned to our rooms. Fortunately for us, anyway, by then things were more or less settled, and rooms had been assigned, and cots had been distributed, and mosquito netting, and all that. So anyway, by the way, on that point, we were interned on the 25th, and the conditions apparently were such. On the 26th, I came down with dysentery, fortunately, amoebic dysentery. So I went straight into the camp hospital, where I think I spent 3 weeks. My fever was, I remember being told by the nurse, 106.2 at one point. But I lost a lot of weight initially, but the very next day, after we were interned. So anyway, that was my introduction to the camp, dysentery. I don't know how I came down with it so fast. It was incredible.
So then when you got out, I mean, some other people had been there. Did you know other people at the camp when you arrived?
I knew a number of kids my age, yes, from school. I was only then in being 11. I was in 6th grade, so I knew a number of friends, young kids who were friends, had been friends from school, and a few I had known earlier who we weren't going to the same school, but I had known them earlier. So I knew a number of people and a few adults.
Were there any other people from your synagogue that were at the camp?
Yes, there were.
Maybe you could say a whole sentence, right?
There were a number of people from the synagogue. Not that many, because as I recall, most of them were non-enemy aliens, had been from Europe or something like that. So it seems to me not that many were interned.
How did your parents describe the whole situation to you? And here you had this congregation in school. Here they had come from Europe. I mean, how did they, once you actually got to the camp and you were taken from a German family, I mean, how did they explain to you that you were being chosen to be rounded up as opposed to other people?
They didn't. I never asked. I seemed to know what was going on. I think, at the risk of sounding immodest, I was pretty well sophisticated. I mean, I read a lot and all that. I've always been a good reader, and I knew what was going on, and I don't recall any specific explanations that I asked for or was given. And I knew what was happening. I didn't really need that sort of attention.
Once you were in the camp there, did the Jewish community maintain any kind of its own religious service there? And if so, how did you do it?
No, there was nothing in the way of Jewish religious services in the camp. There were for other religions, mainly Christian, of course, but there was nothing. There were no Jewish religious services in the camp. The Japanese, initially, the first couple of years, as I recall, let those who applied for passes on certain religious holidays, New Year's, Yom Kippur, would let them, or at least some of them, go out to the synagogue to attend services. But there were no such services in the camp.
So when you had your bar mitzvah or went out to these separate services, how did it feel to kind of be out on a pass and see people that were walking around in quote-unquote freedom?
Well, it was strange. I mean, it was different, but having lived in the Philippines so long, it wasn't that strange or different to me. Again, being only at that time 13. I enjoyed seeing the different sights and all that, and seeing friends at the synagogue, etc. But it wasn't that big a deal to me. I don't know why.
How did you spend your days then at the camp after you got well, and then what did you do in the first few years?
Well, fortunately we had school. A number of teachers. Everybody was interned of all walks of life, including teachers, and they kindly volunteered their services. They obviously weren't getting paid, but they volunteered their services, and we had classes. So I finished 6th grade and 7th grade, and I was in the 8th grade when we were freed. So 3 years of schooling, and mainly, apart from school, I did a lot. I was a voracious reader. There was a camp library, and I used to spend a lot of time. There was a counter. You'd wait in line until you got up to the counter. Books would be turned in and passed down the counter, and if you wanted one, you'd hold it. If not, you'd pass it on. So I read everything. Mysteries, westerns, science fiction, humor in particular I loved. I even read dictionaries. I mean, you name it, I read it. Ellery Queen, everything. Anyway, so I did a lot of reading. I became interested in sports in the camp, from 11 to 14. I hadn't been before, but now I got interested in sports. I was in a basketball league. We had 4 rounds of play, and we won the first and fourth rounds and won the playoffs. So, what else did I do? Well, that probably mainly summarizes it. Yeah.
Did you, so in terms of a camp job, I understand people go ahead and had different camp jobs. Maybe you could tell me, how did your parents spend their time? Just say my parents.
Yes, my parents in the camp, as you know, everyone had a job assigned to them. My father was on, I forget what it was called, sort of a cleanup patrol. It helped clean the bathrooms. And my mother was on one of the ever-present vegetable peeling details. They'd call, today we need detail, I forget, Group A or whatever, Group B. So she was in one of those groups and would help clean and peel vegetables for the day's food. And the story, of course, is you tried to peel the vegetables as thickly as possible because you could take the peeling with you and then cook it up. So those were their particular jobs.
Was your family ever used to, before you entered the camp, do this whole thing, did you keep any kind of a kosher diet? Did you know what kosher food was before you got there? Tell me about your kind of life before and then during camp life.
My parents were fairly religious. They weren't Orthodox, however. I must confess I've never been particularly religious myself. So in terms of following a certain diet or anything like that, the camp wasn't a hardship. But of course, you didn't have to worry about eating pork or anything like that. There was very little, if any, of that. So.
Great. So tell me a little bit about, the shelter, how your family stayed there, and after you got well from dysentery, what the other health conditions were like, and if there was a difference between the first few years versus the last year.
In terms of health conditions, obviously things got worse over the years. I myself, after recovering from the dysentery, when I was really quite weak, I never had any major problems except on one occasion when I broke an elbow quite badly. And that's a story of itself. But anyway, other than that, I was okay. My parents, obviously, I wasn't positive, but I suspected they would always give me most of the food or anything special that was obtained, and they were getting pretty bad. They were in bad shape by the end. My father had beriberi. His legs were swollen and so on. I'm not sure how long he would have lasted, but they were not in good shape. Thanks to them, of course, I was in fair shape. I went in at the age of 11. I weighed about 110 pounds. I have to admit, I was probably a little chubby. And when we were freed, I was 14. I weighed myself that next day after we were free. There was a big scale in the lobby of the main building where we lived. I weighed 69. So during those 3 growth years, I lost 30, 40, 41, roughly 40, over 40 pounds.
Do you remember the last year about food? Do you remember being hungry?
Oh, well, food, there was not, the last year, of course, was quite bad when the military took over. As I recall, the calorie, average daily calorie ration toward the end was well under 700 calories, maybe 600, 500. It varied.
What
But
were you eating?
it was mainly, we called it lugao, a sort of a rice mush, very watery rice mush in the morning, and sometimes a watery soup if there was lunch. This is toward the end. And in the evening, it's some sort of a stew. In quotation marks, very rarely, if ever, was any kind of meat in it. Basically, vegetable stew. We had gotten so-called comfort kits, I think twice during the war. So we would husband our canned goods and use them on special occasions, like a can of corned beef to mix with rice or something like that. But the rations were quite bad toward the end, and people were dying daily in the camp.
When you'd see that around you, what would your parents tell you? Were you scared you were going to die? Were you scared they were going to die?
Well, everyone felt the same. I was worried about the possible consequences, but everyone was in the same boat, and I didn't go out of my way to be that concerned. What will be will be. I learned in the camp to be very philosophical. I don't worry about things. I tend to be relaxed, and what will be will be. Things could always be worse. Things like that.
Did your father use any of certain parts of strength and a little bit of irony and humor comes from the Jewish faith a little bit more maybe than other places? Did your father or mother ever speak to you in kind of stories of the past that might get you through it all, or did they ever have any little bit of humor? You said you like to read humor books. Did you see any humor in the situation?
I saw a lot of humor in the situation, and I don't know if I have had a sense of humor or partly developed it from my reading of Robert Benchley, Stephen Leake. I read everything in the camp. Anyway, I always saw humor in situations, this is, I don't know how acceptable this is. Shortly after we were freed, everyone had diarrhea because of the change in diet. And also the shelling of the camp, the water wasn't working. And everybody, men and women, had to use the same, on our floor, the same bathroom on the side of the building away from the Japanese shell, where the shells were coming from. I have the cap of a shell here that went through my mother's bed, by the way.
Hold it up here.
Oh.
And then I'll get a shot of it afterwards, yeah. So just,
when my mother heard the shelling begin, she says she got up to look for me. And when she came back, a shell had exploded just outside, on the building outside of her bed, had gone through the concrete, went right through the middle of her bed, and was in the ruins of the concrete underneath, and I've saved it ever since. This is the cap of the shell.
Wow. So was there any other somewhat humorous stories that? So we're doing the distance.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
No problem.
So I was in line. I got distracted. I was in line. I tried to wait a couple days with diarrhea. I couldn't go to that bathroom. The toilets were overflowing because the water wasn't working. They had bathroom details who carted out, poor guys who had to cart out pails of this. So I finally got to the head of the line. This was had been the women's bathroom, and And they had, the men's bathrooms didn't, that I recall, didn't have anything on the stalls. It was open. But the women had these flimsy curtains, sort of. So I was, I was maneuvering over the bathroom, and the curtain was about up to here, and the line was out there, and a little girl, about 2 or 3, peeks under the curtain. So that always stuck in my mind. But I always saw humor in everything. I mean, that's probably just me. I'm sure a lot of people did not. But looking back on it, that was quite amusing, but not at the time.
Do you remember any babies being born?
Yes,
children?
yes, there were a number of babies born in there, despite the various restrictions against that sort of fraternization. There were shanties. People had built. Some people were able to build shanties where they could live, and of course they weren't supposed to do this sort of thing. But there were probably several dozen babies who were born in the camp.
So what did, while you were a young teenager, any interest yourself in girls yet?
Oh, I was always interested in girls, even long before the camp, but I never did anything about it. So, well, nothing out of the ordinary. I was probably too young at that time. I had a big interest in girls, but never went beyond that.
So did you have a lot of your friends, but you didn't seem that you were so unhappy there a lot of times. Seems like you were a lot of the kids you knew and kind of playing and stuff, or what?
Absolutely. Probably the saving factor, certainly for me, and I think for all of us teenagers, was just the unusual friendships we formed. Obviously, in that sort of a situation, the bonding, which continues to the present, the bonding is unusual, is very different.
Think about a friendship that maybe you made there that you kind of found important over the years.
Well, I had several good friends over the years that never really kept in close touch with people from the camp, but we corresponded, and there was one family in particular who actually, when they heard we were living in Portland, Oregon, they were from Missouri. They moved to Portland, and we were able to see each other quite a lot. They had 2 sons. I was an only child, but they had 2 sons about my age, and we got together quite a bit. So the friendships were really a saving factor in the camp.
Talk to me about that Liberation Day. How did you know Liberation was coming? Did you have any idea? And what do you remember of Liberation Day?
Well, of course, you never forget that sort of thing. Liberation Day, of course, that came in the evening. There had been all sorts of earlier developments, and we could hear distant gunfire and explosions and so on. But as it got dark, the idea was, well, we'd better get to bed. We don't know what might happen. There's no telling. It's been so many years of rumors that they were about to get back to us, but so we were a bit skeptical. But by 8:30, 9 o'clock, I think it was, we could hear all the noise at the gate, tanks bursting in the gate and coming up the driveway. We were down on the first floor. It was dark, of course. There's always blackouts. Everybody surged out the front door, and we could see these tanks coming up the driveway, and pandemonium broke loose. Firing Japanese guards were being killed and so on, and a lot of bodies were brought in and placed on I still remember seeing them along the first floor, along the wall there. But the overwhelming joy, I mean, there's no way to describe that they were actually back.
Were you with your family or were you with friends?
Both. Well, I was talking with my mother and father initially, but later, as is usually the case, kids always go off by themselves. And when we all surged out the door, I wasn't paying any attention. I wasn't no longer with my parents, but it was very chaotic, of course, as you can well imagine. But and of course, those GIs looked like gods. I mean.
So when was your mother's bed shelled? Tell me the
Oh,
shelling.
the Japanese shelling. Now we were freed the evening of February 3rd. The Japanese shelling began. It lasted several days. Began on February 7th. I don't know, by coincidence, just after General MacArthur had visited the camp. He left, and a little while later, the shelling began. And as I say, my mother got up to look for me, and this occurred.
After that, how long did it take you to actually leave the camp physically, and then where did you go?
Well, we were not priority returnees. The groups of internees began leaving in a few days. The military nurses almost immediately were returned. We were there for almost 2 more months. We were freed February 3rd, and we didn't leave till we were taken out on trucks to board a ship. I believe it was March 27th or 8th, so almost 2 months. And the ship itself, of course, a troop transport, the SS John Likes, I remember that. And we were in the middle of a huge convoy. Everywhere you looked, there were ships. I guess we were placed in the middle for safety reasons in case of submarine attack.
And where did you go?
Well, the convoy went south from Manila. I think we were the first ship to leave Manila after the harbor was cleared of mines and so on. We went south and we docked at Hollandia, what was then Hollandia, New Guinea. And then we left the convoy. The ship sailed by itself down around south of the Solomons and then up, and we stopped briefly. We didn't get off in Honolulu, and then we finally ended up 37 days later in we landed San Pedro, the seaport near Los Angeles.
How did you know what you were going to do when you came to the States?
Well, we didn't. All I knew is that we would be. My father's family, most of them, his siblings, lived in Portland, Oregon, where they had returned from Palestine in the 20s. He hadn't seen any of them since 28, since he left for Manila in the Army. But I knew we would go there. I didn't know what anyone would be doing other than that I would be going to school. Oh, I was in high school. I had started first year high school in the camp. I forgot. So anyway, we stayed in Los Angeles a couple of days. People used to look at us as we walked by and shake their heads pityingly and give us words of encouragement. Apparently they knew that maybe from news reports or from the way we looked, we had Army clothing and we were gaunt. Apparently they knew there were ex-internees there, and I always remember that with amusement. They used to look at us and say, give us words of encouragement. Anyway, we went up by train to Portland. My father, I had an uncle, fortunately, who owned a couple of small apartments. He'd saved an apartment for us. So we moved right into this apartment. My father didn't know what to do with himself in the U.S., so he went back, started up his business, which had been destroyed, rebuilt our house, which had been destroyed. We saw it. A GI drove us there in a Jeep.
You mean he started up his business in the Philippines again?
Again, he went back, started his business. They lived there.
Okay, so say again, so
Oh, I'm
after
sorry.
this, you came back to the mainland, and then your father went back to the Philippines.
We lived, when we ended up in Portland, Oregon, we then lived there. My father decided to return to Manila to start up his office equipment business again. And when I graduated from high school in '48, I went to college. My mother went back to Manila to rejoin my father. He'd come over a couple times, but she went back. So they were living in the Philippines. I went to college, and from then on, I hardly ever saw them again. A few times, until they finally retired. My father finally sold his business and quit in 1982. He was 80. He finally gave up, 80 or 81. They moved to Florida partly because we could drive down to see them from Maryland, and partly because they had several friends from Manila in the Boca Raton area. So my father lived until 1995, and my mother till 2001. So it's quite a story.
So your parents just kept going, and
Yeah.
and where did you decide to go to college, and when did you tell anybody what you had been through?
Well, after high school, I went just down the road 100 miles or so to University of Oregon, where I had a tremendous time. I almost flunked out, fooling around and enjoying myself first couple of years. Anyway, I graduated, then I went on for a master's degree, and then I ended up finally on the East Coast, drove east, stopped to see a couple of ex-internees on the way. This was in the late 58, and I married this elementary school teacher I met in Oregon and at the university. And we ended up here. I got my PhD at the University of Maryland, and then this job opened up at right near here at American University, and I taught there ever since. I didn't think I would, but I did.
So tell me, when did you first tell people, other than the people that you saw you first in San Pedro Port there, what you had been through? I mean, you got to high school in Portland. What was it like to be on the mainland in a high school?
Well, I myself wasn't reticent about telling people about the Santo Tomas. I sort of enjoyed it. My parents didn't really like to talk about it. I enjoyed it. When the occasion presented itself, I'd let people know. I came in the summer. I had to go to summer school. They said, if you go to summer school, we'll give you your first year of high school. We'll say it's okay, because it was interrupted by the liberation and so on. There was no more school. And everyone seemed to know, because of the sudden entry, that I had been in the camp. It was fairly common knowledge, but anyway, I was never bashful about talking about it. I've always enjoyed it.
Two other questions. Where were you? Do you remember VE Day, and do you remember VJ Day? Talk about those.
Absolutely. We arrived.
Say VE Day.
I remember both VE Day and VJ Day, of course, quite vividly. We arrived in Oregon by train. I think it was about a day or two before VE Day. We arrived in San Pedro in Los Angeles. I think it was May 2nd. Came up after a couple of days. Came up by train. And about a day or so later was VE Day, which, of course, I read about in the newspapers, listened to on the radio. I never went out to participate in any celebrations, but I was well aware of it. And same with VE Day, which occurred VJ Day, which occurred a few months later after the atomic bombs were dropped, and of course Russia entered the war. Soviet Union entered the war.
Did you have any special feelings about the atomic bomb being dropped on Japan?
Well, at the time, everyone seemed to feel that it was the atomic bomb being used on the Japanese was certainly appropriate, that it was a necessary thing to end the war. And I've heard all sorts of pros and cons ever since then. I still remain convinced, maybe wrongly, that it was necessary, but I may well be wrong.
So two last questions, we're almost out of the battery time.
No.
Did your family speak Yiddish at all? And what did you know about Yiddish at the time?
They both, they could initially communicate only in Yiddish and some Hebrew also, because she was from Poland, etc. Anyway, they both spoke Yiddish. I picked it up, but I never really learned it. I know a lot of words and so on. I never really spoke it myself.
And is there anything else you wanted to add from the notes you made as you looked at your sheet for a second?
Incidents that I could go into the negative. Maybe I've been too positive here, but with the humor and so on, I came out with bad eyes. I'm wearing contacts, bad teeth, bad gums. As the saying goes, my teeth are perfect, but my gums have to come out. And my growth was stunted, I know that. Not as tall as my father. At one point I had osteoporosis, which certainly contributed, the camp contributed. But, you know, there are a lot of negatives, but there are a lot of positives, and mainly the friendships from the camp. And well, you wouldn't want to do it again, but it's something I at least like to relive, unlike probably a lot of other people who went through it. So.
Great. Well, excellent. Well, that's just wonderful.
Oh,
So,
good.
really, okay, so I'm just going to sit there and watch it. Okay, great.